second panel. My name is Mark Schmidt. I'm the executive editor of the American Prospect and longtime affiliate of the New America Foundation. And I was pleased to be here. I was privileged to be kind of present at the creation of the Social Contract Initiative in 2006 or so, and glad to see it has evolved to this level. I think back then, which were definitely different economic times, I think we were even then beginning as we got into it to really think of it in terms of assumptions, that what we call the social contract really does embody a set of assumptions about how we think the economy works, about how we think individuals relate to the economy, about how we think different levels of the roles of different levels of government and so forth. And I think we were trying from the very beginning to push some rethinking about those assumptions, and I think the economy has certainly forced that rethinking in a way that's very, very clear from the first panel, and I hope will be clear from the second panel as well. And I think when we talk about the framing topic here is the adequacy of the social safety net, and I think what's important to think about there is adequacy not just in terms of is there enough? Are we spending enough? But is the structure that we've created and the assumptions that are built into those structures adequate to the structural changes in the economy? And I think I think over the past decade or so, we've seen a lot of changes and actually experimentation in the structure of social insurance and how we provide, how we make the social safety net work, from shifting welfare benefits to a block grant to the growth of tax credits and refundable tax credits as innovations in both the social safety net and the system of work supports, all of which embody certain assumptions about how we think things will work and how we think things will go. And I think this panel is well suited to really look at how some of those assumptions work in the context of both the current economic situation and the economic situation as Heidi suggested in 2013 and beyond, which is in many ways not as different from the current situation as maybe we would like it to be. We're going to our first speaker will be Heather Boucher, who's a senior economist at the Center for American Progress and somebody whose work I've followed and enjoyed for years and years, who will talk a little bit about the employment situation in the macroeconomic context. Christopher Howard, who is the Pamela Harriman Professor of Political Science at the University of College of William and Mary, will speak next if he is able to get here in time. He is, and if not, he'll go third. He's the author of a book that I think influenced a lot of us in starting up the next social contract program, which is a book called The Hidden Welfare State, about the role of tax credits and tax benefits in creating the structures that we know. And finally, Michael Lind is the policy director of the Economic Growth Program at New America Foundation and co-founder of New America Foundation, and inspiration to all of us, who will talk about some of the history of the social contract. So I'm just going to turn it over to Heather. They'll speak. We'll have time for questions, and we'll be a good rocking panel. Thank you. You can do whatever you want.
Okay, I'm going to stand. I like stand. Just shut this though. Stand and shut. There we go. Thank you, Mark. I thought you were going to say that you're around for the origins of the social contract itself, and I thought that was rather, At any rate, economists shouldn't try jokes. We should exactly. I was like waiting for where that was going to go. So I am just very excited to be on this panel today and to speak to all of you about this issue. The assignment that I was given, or at least the email that I got, was to think about the adequacy of the social safety net. And as I was sort of pondering that, I realized that was a question that I had been thinking about constantly over the past couple of years, but maybe in a slightly different way than we typically think about this. As I wasn't just thinking, I haven't been thinking about it just in terms of the humanistic, anti-poverty, what's good for family issues, but in terms of the adequacy, in terms of the macroeconomy. In 1935, when the Social Security Act created many of the programs that provide the foundation for our social welfare state, These programs did two things. They both alleviated hardships, on the one hand, for families, but at the same time, they were designed in many ways to act as automatic stabilizers and to reduce labor supply at a moment when you had too many people out there searching for jobs that didn't exist. Now, of course, alleviating hardships is an important role of these policies, but I will leave that for another conversation. You know, the Social Security Act gave income support to both those who could not find work, the unemployed, as well as those who our society believed should not work, the aged, widows, and later on the disabled. And this, of course, had the effect of lowering the labor supply, as well as creating these countercyclical funding streams that could stabilize the macroeconomy. So when I say stabilize the macroeconomy, I want to sort of break that down for you. And I will note that that the labor supply piece, or the Social Security and disability piece, I think is also, I will leave for another conversation. But on the macroeconomic stability question, in times of high unemployment, the unemployed lose their jobs, they stop spending, and those of us that still are lucky enough to have our jobs oftentimes cut our spending as well, which of course creates this downward spiral that we've talked a lot about over the past couple of years. Fewer customers means fewer sales, means less investment. We're all familiar with how this is sort of playing out. Now, the programs that can automatically pump money into the economy in hard times can add demand and spur economic growth. But in order for this to work, in good times, we have to put the money aside in order to pay for these programs, or we need to deficit spend them. I mean, the whole premise is that you cannot pay for them in the moment. You either need to have already paid for them, put that money aside, or you need to be comfortable with borrowing now and then paying them back in the future. But either way, it's either taking from the past or taking from the future. And in that way, these programs help smooth the economic cycle. So in bad times like now, they're adding demand, pumping demand into the economy. But in times of full unemployment, when you don't want to be crowding out private investment, when the economy is doing just fine, you take a little bit of money out to set it aside. Now, of course, this macroeconomic stabilization piece is more urgent now than in any recession in recent history. In the 1980s, the last recession, when we saw double-digit unemployment, that was caused by the tightening of monetary policy by the Federal Reserve under Chairman Volcker because they were trying to address rampant inflation. The federal funds rate hit nearly 20% in 1981, which stopped inflation, but 20% gave the Fed a lot of wiggle room to have effective monetary policy that could spur economic growth. Of course, during this recession, the federal funds rate has been at 0 for nearly 2 years now, and I know that the prior panel talked a little bit about the non-traditional means that the Fed has been using and is now looking to use to boost spending. You know, and people, as Jamie sort of the last answer in the previous panel said, you know, economists are all abuzz about whether or not this is going to work. And there are real questions as to whether or not this additional monetary policy can work to stabilize the economy. But what we do know is that the automatic stabilizers, the demand side policies, do work. We've seen that. And in fact, this is one of these issues that goes beyond left and right economists. This is something that the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office knows. This is something that Mark Zandi, advisor to candidate McCain, Senator McCain, has repeatedly said. Unemployment insurance, food stamps, other programs that are part of the safety net provide the biggest bang for the buck when demand is low. So they're not just important for helping families, although that is, of course, very important, but they're also important for our macro economy. They're, quite frankly, at this point, in this kind of recession, the best tools we have. So turning back to the overarching question, is a social safety net adequate given the high unemployment that we have today? The answer is both yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, Social Security has been the best anti-poverty program our country's ever seen. That's clearly effective. And unemployment benefits have pulled 3.3 million out of poverty over the past year. That's incredibly effective. And the Recovery Act increased funding to many of these programs and helped pull us back from the economic brink. It helped stop the tide of hemorrhaging job losses. So that has, of course, been very effective. But the political will for expanding these programs appears to have evaporated sometime, last spring, or I would even argue it started evaporating this time last year. And the debate has become whether or not families deserve these dollars, which is, a question that maybe our nation needs to have. It seems to me that that is really a moral and ethical question about what we think, about what our colleagues in the country, what do we call them, citizens? Sorry, economists, colleagues, not citizens, but what citizens actually deserve. But there is another question, which is what I'm trying to focus on here today, which is what do we need to push our economy back to full employment, which is the legislatively mandated goal of the Federal Reserve, and we do have, that is supposed to be the goal of economic policymaking. Now, one reason why I think there are two reasons I want to point on this morning why we've lost the political or what the challenges are. One is that we've left too much of the job of macro stabilization to the states. They're not equipped to deal with it, and they haven't had the political will in good times to do what they needed to do. So when the Social Security Act was signed in 1935, it was, as all great pieces of legislation are, a great compromise against a number of competing interests. And on the one hand, the feds had control over the retirement plan, over Social Security, and then eventually over the long-term disability program. But the states were left to determine the eligibility and benefit levels for programs like cash assistance, welfare, child care assistance, unemployment benefits. These are things that have a direct sort of labor supply effect in the short term, and these were the policies that were left to the states to decide. And in many ways, this has not been an effective strategy. For example, the state unemployment insurance trust funds. These trust funds are where the money is supposed to be put in the good times so that in the dark days like we're in now, there's money available. Those trust funds were only 50% capitalized in 2007 before the recession began, meaning that the experts that looked at it said, we only have about half as much money as you would need for a typical recession. And of course, this has not been a typical recession. And so, of course, most states are now in, their trust funds are insolvent. We have a massive solvency crisis because the states did not forward fund that program, which in turn is hampering our ability to effectively use that program as a macroeconomic stabilizer right now. And while there is an element of the unemployment insurance program that is designed to automatically increase the number of weeks people get as the unemployment rate goes up, that's actually built into the system, it doesn't work. And we have not addressed this issue for decades now, leaving the only way, effectively, to increase the number of weeks above 26 weeks that someone can get for unemployment benefits, leaving that decision up to Congress, where, as we've now witnessed over the past year, this has become a political football, and we've not, I will be, it'll be shock and awe if by November 30th we extend those long-term unemployment benefits that expire at the end of next month. And the debate that we've been having has been about whether or not people deserve those benefits, not as much about whether or not it's good for all of us, good for promoting full employment. I would note that the long-term unemployment benefits currently being pumped out there through our economy account for about 6 to 7/10 of total personal income in the United States, which is a fairly large number, especially when you consider that personal income fell by a little over, that's about half as big as personal income fell by over the recession. And we thought that was pretty dramatic, but we're talking about pulling out of our economy this huge chunk of change, over $77 billion, because we can't sort of get our act together and don't think people deserve these benefits. That was some air quotes there for anybody listening on the tape later. So I probably need to wrap up. Yes? Okay. So I think that, as we're thinking about these basket of issues, the role of the states is important, and I think that we can't leave macroeconomic stabilization policy to them. The other way that we have seen this not be effective is that the states have been pulling back on their spending just when the economy needs it most. And we need to think seriously about creating the political will to support these policies, and it needs to go on two tracks. I mean, one is this sort of moral and ethical, what do we need to do for the citizens, for our friends and neighbors around us, but also we need to help reframe the conversation about what is good for the economy and the important role that these programs play in regulating the macroeconomy, and articulating that there's a logic to that you pay in good times, you pull out in bad times, and that this helps smooth the cycle. I think one of the missed opportunities over the past couple of years is, as we pump those recovery dollars into the economy, the American public, poll after poll shows, and I believe we'll see on November 2nd, some real sort of meat on this, is that folks didn't understand. They didn't really get why we needed to do this, and all they sort of heard was that it was a bailout. We lost that connection between making sure that people have money in their pocket and that people are being paid wages means that we have consumers, which is good for the economy, that sort of virtuous cycle that the economy can spin on is something that people no longer can wrap their heads around. And I think we need to refocus some of our conversations on doing that if we care about the adequacy of the social safety net.
Thank you, Heather. I think that was terrific. It reminded me of one of my aha moments years ago when I was kind of immersed in unemployment insurance issues, was realizing that it was far from just being a compassionate thing. It was kind of the deal that we cut with employers to help them manage the flexibility of their labor force, and so that car companies could lay off employees and not have them move to Texas and disappear, that they wouldn't lose the investment they'd made in skills. And we seem to have lost that notion completely when we think of it only as a matter of compassion. So I really appreciated that framing. Michael Lind.
Thank you. I'm going to use my few minutes here to cover several hundred years very quickly. I think it's useful. We talk about this safety net, the social contract, and so on. In fact, we have a hybrid safety net or social contract. It's a blend of several traditions, an incoherent and somewhat arbitrary blend that can only be understood as a result of history. And so I just want to use the time here to set the framework for that. There are two elements of the social contract as we define it. One is adequate income for workers, and the other is economic security for non-workers. For most of American history, the labor markets were rigged to favor white male breadwinners. That was the major public policy. We did not have a free market in the labor market. Through decentralization by means of homesteads, the abolition of slavery and of indentured servitude to eliminate unfree competition, mostly to white male laborers, immigration restriction, first of Asian immigrants and then of the European immigrants in the 1920s, female protective legislation, all of this was designed to create a tight labor market for white male breadwinners. As we get into the middle and the second part of the 20th century with the Civil Rights Revolution, sexual and the end of gender discrimination, we shift towards new techniques to help workers, including non-white workers and female workers. Those include minimum wages and hours laws, like those of the Federal Labor Standards Act of 1938, full employment policies, which at least in terms of aspiration go back to the 1940s. The most recent of these measures is the wage subsidies to low-income workers, of which the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, is the most important. Now, one way to think about this is that any country has a choice of how it arranges its wage policies. You can have a low-wage, low-subsidy system, which I call market fundamentalism. The New Deal system was essentially high wages and low subsidies. That is, people working 40 hours a week were not getting subsidies for the government. They did not have wage subsidies. They had a high minimum wage, which was a living wage for much of the New Deal period in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. In the neoliberal era, which goes back to the 80s and 90s, this is when you get wage subsidies combined with a minimum wage that's eroded by inflation to the point at which if you're working at a minimum wage, you can be below the poverty line, and you need the EITC to top it up. So the present system, I think, can be accurately described as a low-wage, high subsidy system, at least for low-wage workers. A high-wage, high-subsidy system, well, that's Sweden. That's Nordic social democracy. So those are among the possibilities. Accident, illness, old age, loss of a job. These are the four horsemen that ride roughshod over lives and fortunes of millions of wage workers of every modern industrial community. In the words of I.M. Rubino, one of the fathers of social insurance in the United States. And here you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse by Albrecht Dürer, whom we have recently seen visiting our country. Economic security is for those Americans who are not in the wage market, who are not wage earners, whether they're retired or they're too young or they are disabled or ill. Means-tested public warfare here, it's welfare. Means-tested public warfare always existed as well, of course. Means-tested public welfare goes back to the colonial period. At the state and local level, there has always been public relief of some sort, usually fairly stingy and punitive. Employee benefits, sometimes called welfare capitalism, comes on the scene, at least in a few large corporations, in the early 20th century. And in the 1920s in particular, you had many progressive Republicans arguing for employer-based benefits. Contributory social insurance, like Social Security, is a product of the 1935 Social Security Act, and later on of Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s. Finally, in the neoliberal period, from the 80s and 90s, we've seen a shift that Dr. Howard has written about very eloquently towards tax-favored private accounts. This is doing welfare policy and economic security policy through the tax code. So, for example, you get the child tax credit, a European-style child allowance, but it's done in the form of a refundable tax credit rather than a direct payment, and thus it's acceptable to both political parties. Now, as a result of these different traditions, we get an extremely complex pattern of economic security policy in the United States, and if it seems confusing, it's because it is. For example, in healthcare, you have welfare capitalism, you have the employee benefits system, that is employer-provided health insurance. You have social insurance, where you pay a tax and then you get the socialized benefit in the form of Medicare and Medicaid. Finally, you have private accounts, part of this hidden welfare state of tax-based benefits. With retirement security, you see the same complexity. You have both employee benefits in the form of employee pensions, Social Security, classic social insurance, and private accounts in the form of IRAs and 401ks. Here is arguably the problem with private accounts, which was one of the popular proposals for either adding on to the existing economic security system or replacing it, for example, through the privatization of Social Security. And just to editorialize, it's remarkable to me that anyone is even still thinking about health savings accounts and about private Social Security after having two stock market crashes in less than a decade, but there you have it. There are limits to redistribution in the United States and in other societies for two reasons. The first is one of the most robust findings of social science is that highly diverse societies, diverse ethnically and racially and perhaps also regionally, have very, very limited redistribution, and this holds true for multi-ethnic Switzerland in Europe as well as in the United States. Racism is a major factor for the limitation of the welfare state in the United States. And this is just something you have to work with. And as not only the United States, but as Western European countries become more ethnically diverse as a result of immigration, it may become more and more difficult to have the kind of universal solidaristic policies that very small homogeneous societies like those of Scandinavia have enjoyed for most of the 20th century. In addition, to the political problems posed to very redistributive programs for solidaristic policies, there's an economic danger of relying on the volatile incomes of the rich for revenue. One of the approaches of the neoliberal period, which arguably came to an end in 2008, although some people don't realize it, is that particularly in the United States and in Britain, you had so-called third-way Democrats and third-way Labor Party members, the Clinton and Blair administrations, essentially investing the future of their welfare state in the success of a highly financialized economy, where much of the wealth was driven by asset bubbles, both real estate and finance. And as we've seen now, when the FIRE sector, the financial sector collapses, finance, insurance, and real estate, then if that is your model for coming up with benefits, both for the middle class and the poor, then you're in a real crisis. Whereas if you have what is, at first glance, a more regressive system of having your social insurance in the form of universal programs largely benefiting the middle class, but also paid for by contributory taxes like payroll taxes of the middle class, then you still fluctuate with recessions and even depressions, but there's less volatility on the revenue side. So this is something to think about if we're thinking not merely about short-term crisis measures, but basically rebuilding a system which has now collapsed. So I'll conclude with my own particular view, which is a solvent and politically sustainable social contract. On the income side, you want adequate income for workers. And the high-wage, low-subsidy model is arguably better for a number of reasons, not just, there's a fundamental value, that is, if you work 40 hours a week, you should not need government subsidies in order to make ends meet. So it's politically sustainable. But at the same time, to the extent that you have a payroll-based system of social insurance, then a high wage, which is a living wage, a minimum wage that actually allows people to make ends meet, makes your social insurance system, like for example, Social Security, much more solvent. Economists have argued that if you have a living wage, that this will, a much higher minimum wage, this will cause mass unemployment. Well, we have mass unemployment now, but if that is a problem, it ought to be addressed by measures like guaranteed public employment to create tight labor markets. Arguably, this system we've had during the neoliberal period of low wages and high subsidies is unsustainable both politically and economically. And finally, economic security for non-workers. Most PhD economists, I'm not one, prefer targeted means-tested benefits because they think in a sort of Benthamite utilitarian calculus, that way more money goes to the people who need it most, and then less money goes to people who need it less. Well, voters do not think like academic economists. Voters hate means-tested programs. There's an old saying that a program for the poor only is a poor program. Voters here and around the world are much more supportive of universal contributory social insurance. And so what is sometimes held up as a flaw of our social insurance programs like Social Security and Medicare, that is, they mostly benefit middle-class people and are transfers within the middle class, is indeed their purpose. They are not intended to be redistribution from the rich to the poor. They are not welfare. They are social insurance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. It is always hard to follow Michael Lind because you have to bring things down to the ground. But Christopher Howard is with us now, professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary, and author of one of many of our favorite books, The Hidden Welfare State. And hope you can step up and.
No, okay, that's all right. I can just. All right, folks, I'm going to drive about 7 hours round trip today in order to be part of this panel. So I hope you really enjoy the next 8 minutes. This is a get to the bottom line event, so here's mine. I'm going to argue that the Great Recession has not taught us many new lessons about the social safety net. Rather, we've been reminded of issues and problems that have existed for a long time. Some of these problems may be worse now than before, but we've known about them. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just two. The first lesson, we have been reminded about the pitfalls of designing a safety net that relies so heavily on state governments. And here I'm going to take advantage of the variation in programs, some of which require a lot of the states, some of which relatively little, and draw some comparisons, starting with unemployment insurance. Most of the key decisions in unemployment insurance about eligibility, benefits, and financing are left to the states. The national government has some role to play, but it's a relatively modest role. As many of you know, unemployment insurance is in deep trouble. As of last month, the unemployment insurance trust funds around the country have been totally depleted in 31 states. My own state of Virginia is among this group, even though its unemployment rate has been a good bit lower than the national average. The U.S. Labor Department expects that another 5 to 10 states could soon run out of money to pay unemployment benefits. Those states have had to borrow money from the national government in order to pay benefits to their unemployed workers. California has borrowed over $8 billion. Michigan, almost $4 billion. New York and Pennsylvania, over $3 billion each. These are short-term loans, and many of them are coming due soon. Paying the interest and paying back the principal will leave the states with the difficult choice of raising unemployment taxes, cutting unemployment benefits, or cutting other state programs at a time when their economies are already very stressed. This problem is not new. States are supposed to design their trust funds so they build up enough reserves in good times to survive the bad times, but many states do not. In the relatively mild recession of 2001-2002, a handful of state funds needed federal loans in order to pay their unemployment benefits. During the last major recession of the early 1980s, over 40 states had to cut benefits or restrict eligibility for unemployment so they could repay their loans that they had taken out from the national government. Now, none of this would surprise advocates of the Ohio plan. When officials were originally designing unemployment insurance during the 1930s, they wanted states to take the lead, and they wanted to use merit rating as an incentive for employers to keep unemployment low. The fewer workers they laid off, the lower their unemployment taxes. This design was called the Wisconsin Plan. Now, critics at the time argued that this model would not work well in hard times. They didn't believe that the incentives to keep workers would be large enough to matter in a bad recession, and they worried that state funds would be overwhelmed. That's one reason why they favored a single unemployment insurance pool run by the national government. That was the Ohio Plan. And in fact, unemployment insurance did not help many people during the Great Depression. Public works programs were far more important. Besides financing, unemployment insurance has problems with coverage. Approximately 5 million Americans who are currently classified as unemployed do not collect unemployment benefits. They've worked too few hours or earned too little money before they got laid off, or they've exhausted their benefits. This problem has been evident for decades, in good times and bad. The only reason this problem isn't a lot worse right now is because the national government is spending a lot of money on extended unemployment benefits. Example 2 comes from health care. Low-income citizens rely heavily on Medicaid, and state governments are expected to pay up to half of those costs. But the national government supplies most of the money, and it imposes more standards on eligibility than it does for unemployment insurance. With Medicaid, states must cover certain populations, and the national government expanded coverage in the 1980s. Not surprisingly, enrollment in Medicaid has grown pretty rapidly over the last couple of years. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, an additional 6 million people have signed up for Medicaid since December of 2007. This is the biggest jump since the program was created in 1965. Many of them lost coverage when they were laid off or when their employer dropped their private health insurance. States, however, have found it very difficult to deal with their share of the additional costs. Over the last few years, states have been cutting health benefits that are not required by law, such as dental coverage. They've been tightening up on eligibility so that more of the near poor are being dropped from coverage. They're increasing deductibles and copays, and they're freezing or reducing payments to health care providers. Again, there's not much new here. When state budgets are tight, it's quite common to look for ways to save money on Medicaid. Now contrast these programs with food stamps, now known as SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Funding for SNAP comes almost entirely from the national government. The states help pay some administrative costs, but those are pretty small. SNAP is a budgetary entitlement, which means that spending rises automatically when the economy falters and poverty and unemployment rise. The number of people receiving food stamps has grown dramatically in recent years and has grown fastest in precisely those communities hit hardest by the recession. Over 30 states have changed eligibility rules to make it possible for more people to receive food stamps, in large part because the states do not have to pay for these additional recipients. During this recession, the fiscal problems facing state governments have not hurt the nation's ability to provide food for the poor and near poor. And that's a really good thing. At the start of this year, the New York Times reported that food stamps were the only, I repeat, the only source of income for 6 million Americans. In short, if we want a more adequate safety net in good times and especially in bad times, I think we need to find ways of shifting more responsibilities away from the states and towards the national government. The second lesson, politically, we have been reminded, once again, just how much the Republican Party has changed in recent decades. Here I'll compare reaction to the recession of the early 1980s to today. In both cases, unemployment topped 10%. Back then, one of the most controversial proposals offered by Republican officials was to expand the taxation of unemployment benefits. That way you'd give more people an incentive to find work. Public reaction was swift, and the Reagan White House quickly and openly disowned the idea. And now? This summer, Senator Orrin Hatch wanted to make the unemployed take a drug test before they receive benefits. We've heard similar things from the Georgia legislature and from Nikki Haley, the Republican candidate for governor in South Carolina. To my knowledge, no Republicans have denounced this idea. The best you get is silence. To boost the economy, some Republicans in the early 1980s supported a sub-minimum wage for teenagers. This year, Republican Senate candidates in a few states have said that the national government should not be setting a minimum wage, period. This view is not limited to Tea Party candidates. The GOP incumbent in my own district said in a debate this month that states should have more flexibility, even if it meant abolishing the minimum wage. Democrats have denounced these latest proposals, but only Democrats. During the Reagan years, presidential counselor Ed Meese got into trouble with his own party for suggesting that problems of hunger in America had been overstated. Earlier this month, Newt Gingrich encouraged Republican candidates to vilify food stamps. I have not heard a single Republican challenge him on this. Back in the early 1980s, Republican officials agreed, some grudgingly, some willingly, to double the federal gasoline tax in order to finance road building and repair, which would in turn employ over 300,000 workers. These days, support for any tax increase is virtually non-existent. The current recession shows that when boundaries of acceptable debate keep moving to the right, it's really hard for those on the left and the middle to strike good bargains. I don't often find myself longing for a return of Reagan-era Republicans, but in the current environment, it would represent an improvement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and we're going to open this up for questions and comments. Before I do, I want to just really recommend on a lot of the issues that were brought up here, some of the papers, the research and policy papers that are in your folder are really impressive on some of the specific issues of the way the social contract relates to the current economy, particularly this six-part series and also the paper on asset-based social policy in the Great Recession have been really helpful to me in thinking about these issues. So let's open it up for questions. I'll moderate from the podium. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Oliver Scardo. A lot of workers today that used to be regular workers now act as consultants or contractors so that their hours are different and they're not officially workers, so that a lot of them don't qualify for the traditional social safety net programs, and there's a lot of new unorthodox forms of work. So what types of policies and what approaches can be designed for these workers that don't fit into the traditional industrial mode of employment? Thank you.
That sounds like a great question for Heather in particular, and maybe Chris as well.
Yeah, it's a good question, not one that I've actually spent a ton of time thinking about. I mean, I think that, first of all, you're right. I mean, someone who's an independent consultant is not going to be eligible for unemployment insurance, but they are going to be eligible for a lot of the other things. They could be eligible for food stamps, they're eligible for the tax policies and stuff like that we've talked about, and provided they pay their taxes into the Social Security system, they're eligible for the retirement and disability portions. I mean, so the big one that comes to mind when you're thinking about those independent consultants and contractors is the UI portion. But again, that's also dependent on how they're paid. If they are, and whether or not those, it comes down to whether or not the taxes are being paid for them. One thing that, and this may be a little, well, at any rate, one of the things that came out in the media around the BP oil spill was how many of the fishermen and stuff were not paying those taxes, and there was this really interesting moment because you had folks that were not eligible for some of the benefits because they were avoiding the taxes that they needed to pay, or that because they weren't documenting their income, they couldn't get the remuneration from BP that they wanted. So there was sort of this interesting moment to talk about both the importance that we all pay into these social insurance programs, that was a little bit of a missed opportunity there, which is kind of related to your question.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think when you refer to people as consultants and contractors, sometimes you're overlooking the fact that there are a lot of people who are forced to operate that way. They actually should be employees. They have none of the freedoms that we associate with being a consultant or a freelancer, and correctly classifying those employees. We've actually there's a ton of articles in the American Prospect, including a full special report about how to do that classification. Question? Yes, and somebody will bring you a microphone.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Howard regarding unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance became taxable income during the Reagan administration, and neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, I know you pushed about the Republicans, but neither the Democrats pushed to have this changed so that it was not taxable income. I have been on unemployment a while ago, a long time, during my younger years. I'm still young, but not for the extended amount of time that many people are on it now. So when the tax man cometh next year for 2010, and the Democrats have not pushed to take away the taxes, and you say states are going to be hindered by this, what's going to happen to those folks who have collected unemployment for, I don't know, when I was on unemployment it was either 13 or 26 weeks, that was it. The tax man cometh next year for those folks who didn't opt out to say, take out my taxes on my unemployment insurance. So what's your response to that? Because the tax man is going to come next year for this year, and I can't say, I just don't agree with, you keep blaming the Republicans. I didn't hear about the drug test, that's ridiculous. But why haven't the Democrats stepped up to the plate to say, this is taxable income, and they're not doing anything either? Thank you.
I agree. It makes no sense. And like traffic on the 14th Street Bridge, taxes are coming. And I think that, there's going to be a very substantial shift focusing on tax policy in general over the coming months, and sort of what tax cuts to preserve and what to trim back and whatever. And I would fully endorse and hope that there would be discussion that while most of these tax breaks do sort of go at sort of middle and upper middle class people and whatnot, there are some that really provide sort of the wrong kinds of messages to people. And especially at a time when you've got, essentially 5 unemployed people for 1 job opening, it's hard to say that you guys really need more incentives to find work for jobs that aren't there.
One thing I would add on that, though, agreeing with everything that's already been said. You know, for those folks who've actually been out of work for an extended period of time, a year or 2 years, who are only getting their unemployment benefits, they're probably going to depending on their household system, they're going to qualify for many of the tax credits that we have. So, like the earned income tax credit or things like that. So they may actually depend. So, you know, depending on how long they've been unemployed and what their family situation is, they may not actually owe that many if they're actually the folks you're talking about who've been out of work for an exceptionally long time. That's just a small silver lining there. Well, if they have children.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Kirsten Lodel with Lyft. I'd love to push a little bit more on the point that Heather brought up about how it is that we start to really change the kind of public narrative or dialogue around safety net programs, recognizing, as I think we all do, that at this point anything that smacks of kind of war on poverty language, welfare state, even kind of the term safety net and such just really isn't politically palatable on either side. But curious to get any ideas from anyone on the panel about how we convey what can seem like probably pretty hard to wrap your mind around concepts like macroeconomic stabilization as a key result of these safety net programs, but which is such an incredibly important point and might open up a way for advocates and others to refresh what has become a pretty stale set of messages that aren't getting across to the American public right now, and kind of do go back to people's concerns that programs for poor people are poor programs. So would love more ideas on that.
Yeah, I hope all three of you can comment a little bit on the messaging and the political framing, even though we're, you know.
I'll offer a note of disagreement in that there are, in fact, programs for the poor that are quite popular. The Earned Income Tax Credit would be pretty high on that list. This is a program that has grown dramatically, faster than almost anything this side of Medicaid and Medicare over the last 20 years. It's gained support from Republicans and Democrats. And I think that there's also been substantial increases lately to food stamps and growth in the Medicaid program, apart from just sort of cost growth eligibility. And so I think that part of the target here is not necessarily at the poor, but the non-working poor. That there's a distinction in the public's mind here that if you are working, if you're playing by the rules, you ought to get some help. That it's not right that you're working 40 hours a week and you're unable to pull yourself up out of poverty, or it's unfair not to have health care. So I think there are ways, and the Earned Income Tax Credit being one of the best examples here, where people deliberately make contrast between that and TANF as being sort of earned versus unearned. So I think thinking in terms of supports for, you know, the sort of deserving categories, children, pregnant women, workers, there are openings there.
Well, I think, first of all, you don't make the case in terms of macroeconomic stabilization. I think you make the case in terms of right. You paid your unemployment tax as part of a payroll in state unemployment systems, and it's part of a state-federal program. You have a right. You have a right to decent health care. You have a right to a decent retirement. Franklin Roosevelt called for a second Bill of Rights. Conservatives have been denouncing this, for a better part of almost a century now. But I think that's the argument. And that's the argument that is strongest in the case of universal non-means-tested programs. I do think that you run into serious problems, whether it's the EITC or other means-tested programs, with political support, that the majority of voters don't receive the benefits of those programs. Then it becomes a form of charity or philanthropy. But when it comes to means-tested programs, particularly now, because the major problem now, even though the poor are disproportionately affected by the crisis, this is a crisis that has struck across society. And if ever there were a time when you could appeal to middle-class people on the basis of their, not just their interest, but their right to a decent income, when they can't have a job, then I think now is the time.
I would add to that a couple of things. I mean, it seems to me you always have to start with the fact that we live in a country that does value work first and foremost, and that I think it's hard to sort of get around that in any of your messaging. I think the EITC is a perfect example. People like it, as you said, because it rewards work, it does not reward non-work. I think one of the places where we failed, of course, is that, in moving to this work-based model, especially for poor families, we haven't done enough to actually recognize that most workers now are also caregivers. And so while we funded the ITC, we underfund childcare, we don't have paid sick days, we don't have paid family leave. So we've made it virtually impossible for many low-income families to actually make that work. And those issues message very well. I mean, I think people get that because they understand, that there's that conflict. But I think you always have to start with the fact that Americans value work. One thing, though, that I think you need to think about is that there's a lot of surveys now that show that, or that I've seen recently. I'm sure there were some in the past as well, but they show that people really sort of buy this idea that cutting costs is what is good for business, and that's what's good for America. So in my head, I kind of, I sort of always think of it as sort of the Walmart model, that people understand, well, cutting prices is the best thing that we can do, and that the way they do that is by cutting costs, which if a few workers have to suffer, okay, like they sort of, that is sort of the track, the way people are thinking about the economy and how it functions, how we are competitive. And that is not the way it always was in the United States. I think, when we passed these policies in the 1930s, people had a conception that, if you read some of the testimony and conversations about raising the minimum, having a minimum wage, it was that, well, if you do that, then consumers will have the money to be, people will have the money to be good consumers. And so there was a different conception of the cycle that the economy worked on. So I think that's a place to go, but you have to sort of ground it in the notion that it's not about non-work, but it is about work, and link that in some way to the middle class, because people also like that.
Well, one quick reply to Michael's comments here. There's sort of two notions of rights here. One is a right that you earned, right, because you worked for it. The other is a right because you're simply a citizen, and we think we all deserve this and owe it to each other. As much as I would like the second kind of society here, my reading of the general culture and public opinion is people are more receptive to it's a right because you earned it, and that leads to benefits tied to work, and a real conundrum and puzzle about, so what do you do with the folks who can't or don't work at a given point in their lives?
I think it's a great question, and obviously we need a lot more thinking about the messaging. I remember a year or so ago, I was with somebody who's been, lots of money has been thrown at this person to do messaging on progressive issues, and he said, first thing, never ever talk about S-chip. S-chip is a terrible thing to talk about because it's a program for poor people and it's an acronym, and yet nothing has been more popular than the expansion of S-chip early in this administration. Amy. Oh, wait for the mic. 1 second for the microphone.
Do any of you have any advice for those of us trying to work on the state level to advance a more modernized social contract, particularly those of us working in a state that's been suffering a 30-year decline in its job base? I'm from Ohio.
Why did you say what state that is?
I'm from Ohio, but a lot of what you're talking about is that the federal government should be doing more of what the states are doing, but what can states do?
At this moment in time, not a whole lot. I mean, I think that, one of the things that they're trying to do is to get out from under the burden of some of these unemployment benefit loans. And there's a lot of discussion now among governors and Washington about trying to defer or forgive some of these loans to free up some of their resources. Beyond that, it's hard for me to see historically big reshufflings of responsibilities between the national governments and the states. It doesn't happen very often. Workers' compensation is a great example. It's a program that's been at the state level forever. It's got chronic problems that have been there forever. People have tried to get the national government involved, and it doesn't happen. And the program just sort of continues in its difficult ways. My suggestion would be probably more looking for not ways of sort of rehabilitating existing programs, but looking for ways of sort of developing new programs that would sort of fill in the gaps or remedy some of the problems of the existing programs. I think it's so many of these state level programs are so entrenched in bureaucracy and practices in both the public and private sector that you'd be just as advised to sort of think about, you know, other ways of helping people than just sort of what can we do to improve unemployment insurance.
Well, you know, Ronald Reagan proposed federalizing Medicaid, so the idea is not totally unheard of on the right. I agree with Christopher Howard that in the short term it's extremely difficult to change anything, you know, certainly this federal distribution of responsibilities. But if you think that we're going to have to rebuild the system, that it has crashed, then we're not going back to the old system, it's not going to revive. Then if you're thinking in a generational time span, it seems to me that you would have the state governors lobby for the federal assumption of a lot of these responsibilities. And it can be done directly, you know, program by program, or it can be done indirectly through the kind of federal revenue sharing that Jamie Galbraith suggested. If in time we move towards a value-added tax to deal with the deficit and various other problems, federal countries that have adopted value-added taxes or VATs tend to have a kind of federal revenue sharing from the VAT because it competes with the state sales taxes. So, you know, there's a 6-month time span and then there's a 20 or 30-year time span, and you can operate on both tracks parallel.
Well, Amy, you've got a couple of problems in your state, just a few. You know, I mean, I think that there is a few things. It's a really tough question in this economic climate, and quite frankly, it's kind of depressing to figure out how we're sort of going to push through this. But I keep being reminded in my head of a couple of things. I mean, one is that some of the places that we've seen the most vibrant advocacy around issues facing working and middle-class families have been at the state level, like the living wage campaigns or the paid sick days campaigns that are going on around the country that really are connecting, like, what is the role of government in people's lives and in the economy and in supporting living standards. So there's that, which is aspirational, and I mean, they make some difference. They're not going to solve the problems in any way, shape, or form, but they're certainly important. You know, and then I think the other issue, which is not sort of the focus of this panel so much, but you know, the economic development questions and the roles of the states in both helping people at the federal level understand what they need to be doing to, you know, create vibrant industries and all of that, because all economic development is local. So it seems like that's an important messaging. I mean, I think that in some ways you're hamstrung because you can't do a lot, but that's where the conversations happen between the folks that are out voting and all of that next week and the kinds of things that we talk about here in Washington. So, you know, and then finally, I mean, it does seem that there is, you know, the messages that we hear here in DC that are sort of bubbling up from the nation are, you know, they seem fairly angry at people here in Washington, but yet they're angry in a way that doesn't quite, to my mind at least, you know, it doesn't have that sort of logical coherence. And so I keep wondering, you know, where are these 15 million unemployed people, and what are they thinking, and what, you know, how is their experience being translated through what's bubbling up politically? And I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but I do wonder why they're not here yet. You know, why we haven't seen them come to Washington to express their anger and frustration and, you know, demand more from their federal government. It seems like that's something that's got to happen at the local or state level. So.
You may have gotten one good tip here, which is blame Wisconsin, which seems to be part of. All right, I think we're going to wrap this this panel up so that we can move on to the panel on credit savings and home ownership. I'd like to really thank everybody on this panel, particularly Chris, who seems like he has dealt with our underinvestment in infrastructure this morning in a big way.